I've long said that as a country, we have done an absolutely lousy job of documenting our own music. And it hasn't been until just recently that we've started to see some proper Canadian books and proper Canadian collections documenting what we have as a nation accomplished. I guess it sort of started with the book Have Not Been the Same back in 2000. But now there's you, and there's Jennifer Morton's book.
Yep.
And who else?
Liz
Worth's book, yeah. Yep. Why do you think we sucked at that sort of thing?
Well, if you look at all the other places where documentation was happening, or where there was a scene happening that there is a lot of documentation about, quite often it was only about like one person or a couple of people. Like, you know, in New York, there's like Lisa and Richard Robinson who are doing Rock Scene magazine, and then you know, the people who did New York Rocker. So they had like, you know, dedicated paper. And it happened to a smaller scale, on a smaller scale in Toronto with like Shades magazine. But really, it only takes a couple of people to do it, and there just weren't the people doing it. You know, so much of that, you see it, it's endemic in like so many of the systems in Canada, like with record labels, that they, you know, when they signed the Canadian Act, that it was only for Canada. It wasn't a worldwide thing. So, you know, the superpower thing of the US and the UK, it's taken a long time for that to sort of like trickle down to Canada, and for Canadian music to find its way out.
There aren't a lot of Canadian music writers willing to spend all that time on a book that really doesn't pay very well in the end. And if you're only, you know, marketing to, I guess, like you say, like a small audience, it's tough to motivate people to do it. But some people have done it, like yourself, have done it as a labor of love now. And so your book is, well, it's a, what do you call it, a photographic narrative?
A photographic narrative. I mean, I called it a photographic narrative because it, for me, it describes like what the whole feeling of the thing was that was happening. It's not like a documentary. So it's a narrative rather than a documentary, in that it's a sort of linear story, but you know, it's
in that 76 to 80 period,
yeah,
right?
primarily photographs, but you know, with a lot of commentary as well. So it has a narrative both in the pictures and the way that the story of music in the city unfolds, and then also through the copy that I wrote.
People who weren't there don't realize that Toronto was like a point on a triangle. There was, and the other 2 points went through London and New York. So all these bands during that time, all those big bands that we read about, the Ramones from and every, you know, Blondie, they came through Toronto.
And it's funny because, like, you know, when the shows were so small at the edge of the horse or anything, and you would talk to the bands, you know, a lot of them would say, "This is amazing, this is great, we can't believe how many people are here, this is just like London." And, you know, so a band would come here and play to 250 people and say, "This is just like London." And that was part of the clue that, like, oh, this really is kind of the same thing, you know, that these things are happening in the same scale. Because to those bands, they were coming to Toronto, and even though they might have been on the cover of the NME back home, they're still playing to the same size audience as they were, you know, in London and in Toronto.
And it worked both ways too. I was in Rough Trade Records a couple of days ago, and I found a Curse 45.
Yeah.
I saw a B-Girls 45, and they were selling for like 15 or 20 pounds.
Yeah.
So there was that exchange of DNA that was going all over the place.
Yeah, you know, particularly with England, you know, because again, Canada is still a colony, and at that time we had a lot stronger ties to the UK, you know. So we really did have kind of, I think, kind of more cross-pollination then, but definitely more the other way, you know.
So how old were you when you started taking those pictures?
Well, the photos in the book, the earliest ones, I was 14 when I started.
Okay, what were you doing in those bars at 14?
Taking pictures. No, really, it was like once I started going, I mean, I just wanted to see music all the time. And once I was able to get in, then that totally made me feel like, okay, well, I'm just going to keep going. And if I get turned away, then, you know, so what? You know, you go back again another time. And pretty soon, if you're going to the same clubs all the time, all the door people know you. So then they assume that you're old enough because you're there all the time, you know. So getting in on guest lists was another thing too, because, you know, there were some people that I knew in bands that, you know, because I was a kid or because I was there all the time, that they were putting me on the guest list. So all those things kind of just make people believe that something's true, you know.
All right, let's talk about some of the people you shot. I think Deborah Harry, in her prime, was one of the most beautiful women on the planet. And there's a lot of shots of her in the book.
In little short white shorts.
I know.
I can't believe how short those things are.
I know. She was just amazing. Who else? There must have been lots of Teenage Head.
Oh yeah. I mean, the bands that I have the most photos of are Teenage Head, the Vile Tones, and the Ugly. You know, three of the most photogenic bands, and bands that I got to see all the time. You know, that were playing here every week practically. You know.
Who else was there that would be in the book? That's really memorable.
Well, Iggy Pop for sure.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Iggy is always memorable, and some of the photos that I have in there are from, you know, for me, what is his very best periods. You know, the Idiot and the Lust for Life period.
So
and
77, 78.
Yeah, well, 76, 77.
Okay.
And 78 too, because, you know, Soldier as well, or New Values, that period. Of course, the Ramones, lots of pictures of the Ramones.
Oh, Toronto was like their second home.
Yeah, I saw the Ramones a lot of times, and they were always like really exciting to see. You know, Heartbreakers, Johnny Thunders, David Johansen. You know, locally again, like the Ugly, the Mods. Yeah, anybody that I just happened to have my camera with. I mean, lots of times I would take my camera with me deliberately, and other times I would just carry it because, you know, you might see something interesting.
And this is in the day before the camera phone.
Yeah,
you had to have this big camera with you and be careful to.
And it was a hassle too, because, you know, if you're like right up in the front lines, if you're right up against the stage, you know, having this thing to not only like maneuver to take pictures, but to take care of it, you know, to babysit it, because, you know, when you're that young and you're making like so little money, that was a very precious thing for me to buy a camera. It was a really big deal to buy a camera. It was like, well, it was the most expensive thing that I'd ever bought, you know.
What was it? Do you remember what it was?
I think it was, at the time they had a manual and an automatic, and I think it was $30 difference. I think I paid $229 for my camera.
In 1976?
Yeah.
That's a huge amount of money for a 14-year-old.
Yeah. And, you know, to commit to spending that, especially when I wanted to spend all my money on records, and before that, all my money was being spent on records or going to shows, but, you know, your priorities change, or you have to focus for a while to get the things you want.
How many pictures do you think you took?
Oh, thousands. You know, because really I was like taking just snapshots before that. I still have negatives from photos I took when I was like 6 years old. Not all of them, unfortunately. I wish I did, but thousands and thousands of pictures.
You didn't develop them all, because that would have been hugely expensive.
Most of the black and white I did. Almost all the black and white I did. And that was part of why I was able to shoot so many, because, like, you know, the narrative part of it was that I really was in the camera club at school, and we had access to a darkroom there. We had access to equipment, so we had to buy our own paper and film, but film was pretty cheap then, especially if you were buying it in bulk. Like, I would buy a bulk roll of it, which might be like $17, and you could get, I don't know, like maybe like 10 rolls out of it or something, so $1.70 a roll or less than that. So, and then the processing, you know, you'd get all the chemicals for free from the school for the processing, so it didn't cost very much, but all those things added up. You know, if you're shooting like 2 rolls of film a week, you know, that's like $3.40 or $4 that you no longer have to buy a record.
Right. So, did you, why, you went into music with Shadowy Men and Shadowy Planet and King Kong Steely after that. Why did you not become a professional rock and roll photographer?
Well, a big part of it was my eyesight. I have really bad vision, and they didn't have autofocus then. You know, it's like things that are kind of like taken for granted now, like, oh, why didn't you do this way? Things just didn't exist in the same way. I mean, even with the automatic camera, it was like automatic exposure, not automatic focus. So, I mean, nowadays I see so many people with, like, you know, computers built into their cameras that are doing, you know, spectrum analysis, and no, mine was like lining up like 2 little lines so that you would know that it was in focus, and I had to rely on that a lot, where I'm not even like looking at the thing I'm taking the picture of. I'm having to watch like the 2 little lines meeting up so I can tell that the picture's in focus. So a big part of it was poor vision, and part of it was just no opportunity for higher education, which, you know, I felt like I had to have, like that I had to go to college. You know, I still had this belief that you had to go to college or university to pursue something as a career. I think that's much more so true now, but then there's still kind of, you could still do something without having that kind of formal education.
Well, I'm glad you did this because, again, we have done an abysmal job, or at least we have been doing an abysmal job of documenting the things that this country has produced in terms of music. And when a guy like you comes forward with boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff that nobody's ever seen before, all of a sudden that history comes alive again, and people begin to appreciate exactly the contributions that we made to this music.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many amazing bands then, and the lack of documentation at the time, it didn't feel like it was sort of unnatural or too little or anything, because everything seemed like it was operating on a small scale. If you go see a band at the Turning Point, there's 17 people there, you don't really expect that, when is their album going to come out? Of course you want, the band to have an album, but it wasn't like, we're reading about the adverts in the NME and, can't wait for their album to come out. And of course they have an album because there's someone to put an album out for them. But yeah, there was a different expectation. I think our expectations were definitely lower.
Well, I don't think anybody expected punk rock to be the socially transforming movement that it was.
No.
It was supposed to be just something that burned out and fade away very quickly.
No, and in a lot of ways it was. I mean, I think that the kind of the original thing did burn out and maybe not fade away, but it transformed from what that original thing was very, very quickly. And the burning out thing, I think, is kind of, in some ways...
Well, that's part of the narrative, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's like what made it so great, because it just like, it was a flash. It happened in such a big way, and it was like spectacular in making some things really great, but it was also a spectacular failure too, because, it was kind of like this revolutionary, overthrow of everything that didn't happen. Yeah. It happened in small ways, and it certainly like changed a lot of things about culture in very big ways, but those things took a long time,
Yeah, sometimes you don't know history's being made when it's being made.
Absolutely. I had no idea that, anything with these negatives. I mean, I knew that they were important to me, that I had to like save them, and that they were, that I had some things in there that I liked. But honestly, that's part of why it took me so long for this to become a book, other than access to technology to actually see the things, but was not really knowing that it is kind of, I've had these things for so long, and what I've been holding on to has become like history, has become something collectible, has become something that other people have interest in now, where, just...
It's like those hockey cards I have from 1970-71.
Yeah.
They're on a shelf someplace. I'm just going to leave them there.
Yeah.
Because my mother's wanted to throw them out for years and years and years. They're important to me, and maybe one day they'll pay for my my retirement.
Or education.
Well, or that. Well, thanks, Don. Thanks for doing this. I mean, I really appreciate the fact that you've got this book out, because you can show exactly how important Toronto and Canada was in this whole thing. And you can never let that stuff go away.
Well, thanks. I think in a lot of ways too, it's like how important it is now too, because you see the music scene now. There's so much of it that has been directly a result of the foundations that were laid then. So it's really kind of part, just like a snapshot of like it's the Lucy in the evolution of something. I don't know what I'm talking about anymore.
But I know exactly what you mean. Well, thanks, Don. I appreciate it. Good
Thanks.
book, and I urge everybody to have a look at it, because you'll be amazed at all the stuff that went on back then.
Explore Music wears English Laundry apparel.